In a geopolitical landscape already tense with conflict, a proposed minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States has emerged as a flashpoint of contention. The deal, which would grant the U.S. access to Ukraine's valuable mineral resources, has revealed deep divisions not only between the two nations but also in how the arrangement is perceived globally. This analysis examines the complex motivations of the key stakeholders: Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, and Russia, through both mainstream and alternative media perspectives. Ukraine's position: sovereignty versus security. The mainstream narrative is that President Volodymyr Zelensky's reluctance to sign the minerals deal stems primarily from concerns about security guarantees. Ukraine faces an existential threat from Russian aggression, and robust security assurances must accompany any economic arrangement. Ukrainian officials have expressed shock at the disparity between the proposed terms, with the U.S. seeking access to approximately $500 billion worth of Ukraine's natural resources, and the approximately $350 billion in aid provided under previous U.S. administrations. From this perspective, Ukraine's hesitation represents a principled stance to protect national sovereignty while maintaining leverage in international negotiations. While the short-term economic benefits from accessing and developing rare earth minerals would be significant, Ukrainian leadership views these as secondary to security concerns and political independence. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has emphasized that under any agreement, Ukraine's subsoil and resources would remain Ukrainian property, with the country contributing 50% of future revenues to a proposed investment fund for reconstruction. This approach attempts to balance economic development with sovereignty preservation. The alternative narrative, a different interpretation, suggests Ukraine's refusal goes beyond security concerns to resistance against what some view as Western economic imperialism. According to this perspective, the proposed deal represents an attempt to exploit Ukraine's natural resources under the guise of security support. Critics argue that the terms, with the U.S. seeking access to $500 billion in resources after providing $350 billion in aid, reveal the imbalanced and potentially exploitative nature of the arrangement. The rejection is framed as an assertion of economic sovereignty and a refusal to be drawn into dependency on Western markets and political dictates. Some alternative commentators suggest that rather than rejecting the deal outright, Ukraine could use this moment to push for a model that guarantees long-term economic independence and equitable development, one not dictated solely by U.S. or EU strategic interests. The United States calculations: return on investment or resource grab? The mainstream narrative is that the Trump administration has characterized this minerals deal as a trillion-dollar arrangement that would provide American companies with access to Ukraine's mineral wealth while ensuring that the American taxpayers will now effectively be reimbursed for the money and hundreds of billions of dollars poured into helping Ukraine defend itself. This framing presents the deal as a responsible stewardship of taxpayer funds while strengthening a strategic ally against Russian influence. For the U.S., the arrangement would secure access to critical minerals vital for technology and defense industries, potentially reducing dependence on other sources like China. A senior U.S. official has described it as an important political undertaking that binds the two countries together, suggesting benefits beyond mere resource extraction. The collapse of negotiations represents a missed opportunity for the U.S. to secure valuable resources and potentially weakens its strategic position in Eastern Europe. The alternative narrative: critics characterize the U.S. approach as a thinly veiled resource grab, a neo-colonial tactic to control strategic assets abroad. From this perspective, the United States is using Ukraine as a bargaining chip to secure rare earths without adequately addressing the country's long-term security needs. The disparity between aid provided, $350 billion, and resources sought, $500 billion, is cited as evidence of an exploitative relationship. As one Ukrainian source pointedly asked, "What kind of partnership is this? And why do we have to give $500 billion? There is no answer." Alternative voices suggest that the U.S. rhetoric about reimbursement for aid reveals a transactional approach to foreign policy that undermines genuine partnership. They argue that pushing such imbalanced terms risks alienating partners by prioritizing resource extraction over genuine security cooperation. adding weight to skepticism or expert assessments that contradict official enthusiasm about the deal's economic value. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, Ukraine has zero proven reserves of rare earth minerals or processing facilities, contradicting emphasis on these specific resources. Implementation would require multi-billion-dollar investments in extraction and processing infrastructure, potentially resulting in financial losses for participating American companies. European Union. Offering a win-win alternative mainstream narrative, the European Union has positioned itself as a diplomatic bridge builder, supporting Ukraine's stance while emphasizing that any economic agreement must not compromise regional security or Ukraine's political independence. The EU views the deal as part of a broader effort to counter Russian aggression and maintain regional stability. European Commissioner for Industrial Strategy, Stefan Sejourne, has offered Kyiv what he describes as a mutually beneficial and win-win partnership for accessing the country's natural resources. This approach explicitly contrasts with the perceived imbalance of the U.S. proposal, with Sejourne emphasizing that the added value Europe offers is that we will never demand a deal that's not mutually beneficial. The EU's interest in Ukrainian minerals is substantial, with Sejourne noting that 21 of the 30 critical materials Europe needs can be provided by Ukraine. This arrangement would support the EU's industrial strategy while providing Ukraine with investment and development opportunities. Alternative narrative. Some alternative commentators suggest the EU's enthusiastic backing is not entirely altruistic. They contend that the EU is also motivated by a desire to expand its geopolitical influence over Eastern Europe and integrate Ukraine more deeply into its economic orbit, even if that means endorsing policies that may not fully align with local interests. As noted by Slovenian newspaper Vesar, this situation reflects the beginning of an open geostrategic mega-battle between the major powers for control over crucial raw materials. The EU's win-win rhetoric, in this view, masks a similar desire for resource access, albeit with more politically palatable packaging. Critics argue that while supporting Ukraine might bolster the EU's standing as a defender of democracy, it risks entangling the bloc in a project that could lead to economic overreach or imbalance in favor of Western elites, potentially sidelining genuine Ukrainian developmental needs. Russia's opportunistic approach. Dividing the West. The mainstream narrative is that Russia benefits from the deal's failure because a weakened or divided Ukraine is easier to influence. The collapse is portrayed as a diplomatic win for Moscow, underscoring its narrative that Western interference only deepens regional instability. In a calculated move that further complicates the diplomatic landscape, Russian President Vladimir Putin has publicly offered the United States access to rare minerals, including those from Ukrainian territories currently under Russian occupation. During an interview on Russian state television, Putin expressed willingness to offer resources to American collaborators for joint ventures, particularly in the mining sector within what he termed Russia's new territories. This proposal represents a transparent attempt to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty claims and potentially drive a wedge between Ukraine and its Western supporters. Alternative narratives often echo the mainstream on Russia's motivations, but with added emphasis on anti-imperialism. They frame Russia's opposition as a defensive reaction against what is seen as an aggressive, resource-extractive project by Western powers. In this view, Russia is portrayed as protecting not only its own strategic interests but also as standing up for countries threatened by Western economic domination. Putin's offer to provide minerals from occupied territories is seen as highlighting the fundamentally extractive nature of Western intentions, regardless of which power ultimately gains access. The alternative view usually downplays any potential loss for Russia, instead highlighting that the deal's failure reinforces skepticism about Western intentions and encourages a search for more independent economic models in the region. Environmental concerns. The overlooked dimension amid the geopolitical and economic calculations surrounding the minerals deal. Environmental concerns have received comparatively little attention in both mainstream and alternative narratives. Without proper oversight and stringent regulations, accelerated mining activities resulting from any agreement could lead to severe ecological damage, including deforestation, water pollution, and soil degradation. The environmental implications extend beyond local ecological concerns to broader climate considerations, as increased mining operations would likely result in significant greenhouse gas emissions. These environmental risks could create additional challenges for Ukraine's European integration aspirations, as the EU maintains stringent environmental standards that would need to be addressed in any large-scale resource development projects. Could this deal be saved? What's next? Renegotiation possibilities. Mainstream perspective. Saving the deal would require significant renegotiation, incorporating robust, verifiable security guarantees for Ukraine and involving multilateral frameworks, possibly with the EU and NATO. This would balance economic benefits with strategic security concerns. The path forward might include de-escalation and moving negotiations behind closed doors, addressing Ukraine's sovereignty concerns with explicit guarantees, revising financial terms to create a more balanced arrangement, including environmental safeguards and sustainable development provisions, potentially involving the EU as a mediating force. Alternative perspective. Many alternative commentators suggest that any salvage attempt must first address the underlying power imbalance. They argue that rather than a resource extraction deal, Ukraine should push for a model that guarantees long-term economic independence and equitable development, one that isn't dictated solely by US or EU strategic interests. This might involve restructuring the deal as a genuine partnership with mutual benefits, ensuring Ukrainian control over resource development timelines and methods, creating transparent governance mechanisms with international oversight, guaranteeing that profits primarily benefit Ukrainian reconstruction, addressing historical imbalances in international resource negotiations. Looking forward, the current impasse presents several possible outcomes. Compromise agreement. Continued negotiation could lead to a compromise that addresses Ukraine's primary concerns about security guarantees while providing the United States with sufficient economic benefits to satisfy its political requirements. Pivot to European model. Ukraine could move more decisively toward the European Union's offer, potentially using it as leverage to secure better terms from the United States or as a replacement if US negotiations collapse entirely. Increased US pressure. The Trump administration might link continued military support to Ukraine's acceptance of the minerals deal. This approach would place Ukrainian leadership in an extraordinarily difficult position, forced to choose between immediate security needs and long-term economic sovereignty. Complete collapse. If positions remain entrenched, the deal might collapse entirely, leaving all parties to seek alternative arrangements while managing the diplomatic fallout. Conclusion. Beyond resource extraction, the minerals deal controversy illuminates fundamental tensions in the international order. While mainstream media emphasizes the deal's potential to secure critical resources and bolster Ukraine's defenses, alternative narratives raise concerns about economic exploitation and neo-colonial tendencies. They warn that signing under unequal terms might lock Ukraine into a dependency that undermines its long-term independence. The contrasting views highlight a fundamental question. Is the proposed arrangement a pragmatic security economic partnership, or is it a mechanism for furthering Western influence at the expense of genuine national autonomy? As negotiations continue, all stakeholders face difficult choices. Ukraine must balance immediate security and economic needs against long-term sovereignty concerns. The United States must decide whether its approach to Ukraine represents genuine partnership or resource opportunism. The EU must determine whether its win-win rhetoric translates to substantive policy differences from the US approach. And Russia will continue seeking opportunities to divide Western allies while advancing its territorial ambitions. Beyond the specific terms of any agreement, these negotiations will help shape the nature of international support for Ukraine's reconstruction and the country's long-term strategic orientation in the evolving geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe.